How can you grow in your appreciation for Jesus and thus grow in your worship of him? Well, you can do so by learning more about him. The more we learn of him, the more we will love him, the more we'll appreciate him, and the greater our worship of him will be. That's one of the reasons we study the Old Testament. It's one of the reasons we learn the history of Israel. There are connections between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You can't fully understand who Jesus is and what he's done for us unless you understand the story of Israel. The more we learn of these things, the greater our appreciation of Jesus will be and the greater our worship of him. This letter, the letter of Hebrews, was written to a church of Jewish Christians. They were first facing persecution, quite possibly the threat of being banished from the temple or the synagogue. We know that's a possibility because of what happened in John chapter 9. So we're going to look at that just briefly this morning. In this passage, a blind man has been healed. Jesus healed a blind man, and he did so on the Sabbath. And of course, that upset the Pharisees, and so they're trying to get to the bottom of this thing. They want to find out who. They don't know that it was Jesus who healed this man. They're trying to find out what he did, who it was, and what he did. And this man, the blind man, was born blind, and so they call in his parents, the parents of the blind man, and they confront him to find out how he was healed and if it's really their son who was healed. And John records their response. We're just going to read their response this morning. We're in John chapter 9 and verse 20. They answered, "We know that he is our son, and we know he was born blind, but how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." And this is the point. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. That's the Jewish leaders. For already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue, would be banished from the synagogue, not allowed to enter in. Now this took place well before Jesus died on the cross and the resurrection. There weren't a lot of people at this point openly saying that Jesus was the Messiah. Many people were thinking he might be the Messiah. But here already was the threat of banishment from the synagogue and or the temple for saying that he was so. Well, after the resurrection and after the Holy Spirit came down, the apostles were boldly proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah, and other Christians were doing the same. So it is likely that Hebrew readers, Christians in that age, were being threatened with excommunication or banishment from the synagogue and or the temple. And for a Jew, even a Christian Jew at that time, to think, I can't go back to the temple, would really be a horrifying thought for them. So leaving Christianity to return to Judaism was a very real temptation for some of these Jewish Christians that the writer of Hebrews is writing to. He wrote to encourage them to keep their faith in Jesus no matter what. And that's a call for us too. That's a call for us too. We were talking in our Bible study group this morning, the fact that it's kind of easy for us to keep our faith in Jesus. We're all well fed and well clothed and well housed and safe, but we have brothers and sisters in Ukraine today who are not being promised that God's going to keep them alive or keep them healthy or keep them fed, and they might be tempted to not put their faith in Jesus today. And no matter what you're facing, you might be facing something this week and be tempted to not entrust yourself to Jesus. But we are continuing our study of Hebrews this morning. We're in chapter 7. And at this point, our author has already 3 times made a connection between Jesus and Melchizedek. this guy named Mel. And he expected this to have an impact on his readers. He expected them to be aware of who Mel was, and to even if they didn't see the connection between Mel and Jesus yet, what he's going to draw out here in a moment, that they would expect that it's going to be something significant because of what they already knew about Melchizedek. And I admit, for many years, I read this passage over and over, and it didn't impact me at all. I didn't know much about it all. I read about Melchizedek, but I didn't see the connections there, and as I do now. And I appreciate him more, and I hope you will after today. So we need to start this morning, not in Hebrews. We need to start back in the Old Testament. We need to know what they knew about this Melchizedek before we go on to Hebrews. So we're starting in Genesis this morning in chapter 14. We're starting in Genesis chapter 14. And we read the story back there. And I need to set the context up for you. A battle has just occurred. There were 4 kings aligned together against 5 kings. And so they're taking place in this battle. Now, these kings were not kings of countries. We think of kings of countries. In those days, what they called kings were normally kings of large cities and the surrounding area. And that's what we have in this context. If you read the earlier part of the context, you'll see that these are kings of cities and who've aligned together. But you've got these 4 kings against 5 kings, and we pick up the action in Genesis 14 and verse 11. Now the valley no, that's not 11, that's 10. The four kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah. They're raiding into the territory of the 5 kings. They seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food, and then they went away. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. One who had escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. Now Abram was living near the great trees of Mamre the Amorite, a brother of Eshcol and Aner, all of whom were allied with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people. After Abram returned from defeating Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shavah, that is the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. In other words, Abram gave him 1/10 of the spoils that had been recovered from the invading kings. So the spoils all became his, as the general and his army that had gone out here, those who had gone out to fight. And so Abram gave him 1/10, a tithe of the spoils. So we need to look at several relevant points from this passage that we learn about Melchizedek. Number one, Melchizedek was both a king and a priest. He was both a king and a priest. Now that wasn't unusual in that time. Probably these other guys who were called kings were probably priests in their cities, over their territories as well. However, God would not establish that when he gave the law of Moses much later, hundreds of years later. Under the law of Moses, kings were not allowed to be priests. There were no priest kings. The priests were of one group and the kings came from another group. And we'll come back to that idea in a moment. Melchizedek was not a Hebrew. and lived long before the law was given. So it was okay for him to be both a king and a priest. So first point is that he is both a king and a priest. And we'll see the significance of that in a few moments. Number two, Mel ministered outside of Yahweh's promises to Abram. Outside of Yahweh's promises to Abram. If you read the Bible, you'll see that the main thing that God has been doing in human history is to establish a people for himself. He started with Abram, renamed later Abraham, and God's people would come from his descendants, and that carried on all down through Isaac and his son, and then Jacob, his grandson, and then Jacob's 12 sons, Abraham's great-grandsons, and then all down through Israel to Jesus, and eventually to us, include us who have become followers of Jesus Christ, who aren't even Hebrews, but we are a part of the people of God. That's the main thing that's going on all through the Bible, is that God is doing that through Jesus, the Son, bringing to himself a people. That's what the Bible is mainly concerned with, that God is doing this thing. And it would be easy for us to assume that that is all God is doing. Not just that that's the main thing, but that's all that God is doing in human history on the earth. But God is doing much more in the world than you or I know about. And we know from passages like this one that God was involved in revealing himself to others, not just Abraham and his descendants. So this passage reveals that God was involved with people other than Abraham. This sidebar encounter of Abraham was meant by God to increase our knowledge of and appreciation for Jesus through this guy named Melchizedek. So Melchizedek was a priest outside of the promises to Abraham, outside of the primary work of God revealing himself to mankind through the nation of Israel and eventually through the Messiah, Jesus. Number three, Abram recognized Melchizedek as a legitimate priest of Yahweh. A legitimate priest of Yahweh. Further in the passage, he actually refers to God Most High and Yahweh in the same breath. So he recognizes that Melchizedek didn't call God Yahweh, he referred to him as God Most High. Abraham calls him both of those and recognizes Melchizedek as a legitimate priest of Yahweh. And as such, Abram gave Mel a tithe of the spoils. And that points to the importance of Melchizedek, and we're going to come back to that in a few moments. You might be saying, how come he's not dealing with all that now? Because we get to that in Hebrews. That's what the guy in Hebrews brings out. So the first time that Melchizedek is mentioned in the Old Testament is here in Genesis 14. The second time, and only these two times, is Psalm 110. And we've looked at part of Psalm 110 over the last several weeks because this is one of the verses here is quoted by the writer of Hebrews 3, 4, 5 times. Already he's quoted this 3 times. But let's see 2 verses this morning. And here, this is a messianic psalm. Again, it's about the Messiah who's come. And it says in verse 2, Yahweh, the Lord, will extend your mighty scepter from Zion. You will rule in the midst of your enemies. And then in verse 4, Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So there's 2 significant points for us here. A, Messiah will be a king priest like Melchizedek. Messiah will be a king and a priest like Melchizedek. Jesus, in the order of Melchizedek, is both a king and a priest. That was foretold here in this prophecy, in this Psalm of King David, and that lends it weight as well. And we'll cover more of Jesus' priestly role in the weeks to come. And then B, God has sworn that Messiah would be a priest. And we covered that before. But this idea of the king priest, some of you will remember that under the Mosaic law, the kings were not allowed to be priests. And the reason that Saul, the first king of Israel, the reason that Saul and his extended family did not continue to be the kings is that one day, as they were preparing for battle, King Saul took the place of a priest and offered sacrifices to God. And then Samuel, the prophet, showed up and said, "What have you done?" And Saul says, "I was afraid, and the men were afraid, and they were deserting, and I knew we needed to ask God's blessing before we went into battle, and you weren't here, so I offered the sacrifices." And Samuel says, "You blew it, and you lost it. You blew it, and you lost it." So, under the Mosaic law, the kings were not priests. That is significant, and we'll come back to that. As we turn now to our passage in Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 1. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Now first, his name means king of righteousness. Melchizedek means king of righteousness. And then also king of Salem means king of peace. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Just think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. Now the law requires the descendants of Levi who become priests to collect a tenth from the people, that is, their brothers, even though their brothers are descended from Abraham, like they are. This man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth, a tithe, from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. And without doubt, the lesser person is blessed by the greater. In the one case, the tenth is collected by men who die, but in the other case, by him who is declared to be living. One might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham, because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. So we need to see some additional truths about Melchizedek here. Melch foreshadows Jesus. He foreshadows Jesus. First of all, he foreshadows Jesus in his name. King of righteousness, in his place. Salem means peace. The word Salem is closely connected with the Hebrew shalom. And both of these are important truths about Jesus. We learn in Paul very clearly in the book of Romans declares that Jesus established both our righteousness with God and our peace with God. So Melchizedek foreshadows Jesus in his name, and he also foreshadows in the description of his being without mother or father. Now, I believe that is a figurative way of saying that we don't know where he came from. We don't know where he came from. The Jews were all about family identity and tribe. You read in there, and it's important for the Jews to be able to recite, "Oh, my father's father was so-and-so, and his father was so-and-so, and his father was so-and-so, and his father was so-and-so," all the way back to Jacob and Isaac and Abraham. We see two examples of that, both in Matthew's gospel and in Luke's gospel, the earthly genealogy of Jesus. That was important. That was very important. When the Jews came back from exile in Babylon and rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem and reinitiated the cultic, there, the rituals by the priests and such. The priest had to be able to say, I am a descendant of Aaron. My father was so-and-so, his father, not all none. And those who could not do so were not allowed to serve as priests in that new temple. You read of people in the Old Testament, and normally it says, here is so-and-so, and his father was so-and-so, and they're of the tribe of whoever. It was important for the Jews to say that. We don't know any of that stuff about Melchizedek. He wasn't a Jew to start with. He wasn't an Israelite. He wasn't a Hebrew. We don't know where he came from. We don't know who he was. We don't know who his father was, where his people were. We don't know when he was born. We don't know when he was died. We don't know if he was married, if he had any kids. We don't know anything about him. I believe that poetically, the author of Hebrews describes him in that way, which Genesis supports. We don't know anything about him. To draw this poetic conclusion, if you will, that he has an endless priesthood, a priest forever, a foreshadowing of Jesus. Now, there are a lot of people that take this passage, this description of Melchizedek, absolutely literally, and they say, well, it must have been an angel. He must have been an angel, or some other supernatural being, some other spiritual heavenly being. Some have even said he was a pre-incarnate vision or something of the Messiah in that passage. And that may be true, but the text doesn't say so. The text points to him being a real man, a real king, a real priest in a real city. I believe that he is simply a foreshadowing of Jesus, that there are characteristics about Melchizedek as described in the scriptures that point to what is true about Jesus. Number 5, Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. Now, to say that to a Jew is pretty significant. He's greater than Abraham. And our author of Hebrews points that out, that the greater blesses the lesser. What Melchizedek blessed Abraham in that Genesis passage. As an example of some who you might say, well, he wasn't greater than that. You'll remember in the book of Genesis, toward the end of Genesis, that Jacob is about to die. He's very old by this time. He's about to die, and he calls his sons in, and he blesses them. Some of those blessings didn't sound like blessings, but that's what it says, that he blessed them, including Joseph, his son Joseph. Well, now at that time, Joseph was the ruler of all of Egypt. The only person greater than Joseph was Pharaoh in authority and power. And yet Jacob, being Joseph's father, and also having lived so long, was considered very great and blessed his son Joseph, greater than Joseph. Melchizedek blessed Abram, and so we draw the conclusion that Melchizedek was greater than Abram. And then number 6, Melchizedek was greater than Levi and his descendants. Greater than Levi and his descendants. Now the logic here is sound, but can be tricky to understand. But it's based on these two things. Tithes are received by the greater from the lesser. Tithes are received by the greater from the lesser, or paid from the lesser to the greater. And the greater blesses the lesser. So let me walk you through his logic. And we're going to start at the bottom instead of the top. We're going to start at the bottom. The Levites were greater than their brother Israelites because at a crucial time in history, the Levites sided with Moses and God against the other tribes. There was a rebellion going on, and Moses said, whoever's with me, whoever's from me and God, come over to my side. And all the Levites, because Moses was a Levite, he was of the tribe of Levi, all the Levite men came over to Moses. And so God set the Levites apart from their brothers, from all the rest of the Israelites. And thereafter, in the Mosaic law, the Israelites had to pay tithes of their crops to the Levites. Now, a lot of Christians have this wrong. They think that the tithe in the Old Testament was a tithe of money or whatever. It was a tithe of crops. It was a tithe of crops and the firstborn animal. If you had a cow that had a calf, the first calf would go to God. And it was the idea that the crop tithes, that they took those to the temple. They didn't do that. The crop tithes went to the Levites, because the Levites didn't get any farmland. They got a little bit of pasture land for some sheep and some goats, but they didn't get any crop land. The crops were all grown by the other tribes of Israel, and they had to pay a tithe from their crops to the Levites. All right, so all the other tribes are at the bottom, and then the Levites are just a step above them. They're receiving tithes from them. And then the Levites paid a tithe of what they got from everybody else, and they gave their tithe to the priests. That went to support the priests in the temple. So Aaron was greater than the other families in the tribe of Levi because he was the first priest, and all of his male descendants became priests in Israel. So they're a step above Aaron and his family. Though they're Levites, they're a step above all the other Levite families because they were the priests. And our author points out that Mel was greater than Levi, including Aaron, because the line of Levi still in Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. If you can wrap your mind around that he hadn't been, I'm not going to go into it. You just can figure it out. So Aaron was greater than the other families, and then Abraham was greater than Aaron because he came before Aaron. He was the antecedent of Aaron. Aaron was a descendant of Abraham, and the older were considered greater than the ones who came later in the family. So our author points out that Mel was greater than Levi, including Aaron, because the line of Levi, still in Abraham, paid tithes to Melchizedek. And then Mel was greater than Abraham because Abraham paid a tithe to Melchizedek. And Abraham was a very, very rich man at the time. He had 318 male servants in his household at that time. Called them out to go to fight this battle with him, and was much honored by his neighbors. At some point they called him a prince among men, very, very much respected. And yet Abraham humbled himself before Melchizedek and gave him a tithe of the spoils. So we have a diagram. There's the diagram. And so you see the other tribes of Israel are at the bottom. And Levites are a little bit higher, and the family of Aaron is a little bit higher, and Abraham is a little bit higher, and Melchizedek is over all of them, is greater than all of them. But of course, Jesus is above everyone. So our author has stated that Jesus is our new high priest. Somehow he had to explain, since the law of Moses said that the kings cannot be priests, somehow he has to explain how Jesus can be both a king and a priest. And that's what he sets out to do in this book, in this letter. He does it first by explaining what kind of priest Jesus is to be, one like Melchizedek, a famous and important person from their past, not a part of Abraham's story, except as a sidebar, but someone who was both a priest and a king. And as such, he is also an important part of our spiritual heritage. Understanding our spiritual heritage is important to fully appreciating who Jesus is and how he can serve us as a legitimate high priest in bringing about atonement for us. And that's what he does.